welcome back to another M&S tutoring video, and in this video we're going to be learning about the length and midpoint of different line segments. So let's get started with the length of a line segment. Now the length of a line segment can be measured in many ways. You can measure it with a ruler, you can measure it using 2 points given, but in this video we're going to be focusing on measurements we can do when given 2 points, measurements we could do given a graph. So let's say, for example, you have 2 points over here. You have point 1 and you have point 2. And you know that the first set of points are labeled coordinates x and y. And you know the other coordinates are labeled, let's say, h and k, right? But now you want to find the distance between both of these points without actually graphing both of these points. Well, in case there is an actual formula that you could use to actually find the distance between these 2 points, the closest distance formula. And the formula goes like this: the distance is equal to the square root of everything inside the bracket. So you have to remember to do everything inside the bracket first and then square root it. So h minus x squared plus k minus y squared. And if you follow this formula, you'll get the distance between point A, so I'll call this point 1, and between point 2, right? So how did this formula come to be? Well, this formula is another variation of the Pythagorean theorem. If you continue this line in as many units, you need to go right, and then you go up in a 90-degree angle to point 2, you'll get another variation of the Pythagorean theorem. So if you want to go from coordinate, in this it'd be coordinate x to coordinate h, you'd simply just have to do h minus x, right? That's how many units you have to go to the right. And over here, to find how many units you'd have to go up, you'd simply just go k minus y, right? And as the Pythagorean theorem states, the distance, and in this case this is the distance, is basically a squared plus b squared, and in this case is equal to d squared. So that's how this formula was actually originated. Another way you could write this formula, which would be more similar to the Pythagorean theorem, is d squared is equal to k minus y squared plus h minus x squared. And you guys can somewhat see the relationship between the Pythagorean theorem, as in this is c squared, this is, as a matter of fact, it could be a squared, and this could be b squared. So that's the relationship it has to the Pythagorean theorem. So now let's look at an example of how we can use the length of a line segment to solve for 2 different points. So let's say you had point 1 over here, and we'll say the coordinates for point 1 are 8 and 14, right? And you have point 2 over here with coordinates, let's say 14 and let's say 22, right? And you wanted to find the distance between both of these points. Well, how would you do that? Well, all you have to do is you have to plug in the different variables for x and y and h and k into the distance formula. So let's look at the distance formula. First of all, it's d is equal to the square root of h minus x squared plus k minus y squared. So the formula is right over here, and now all we have to do to find the distance is plug it into the formula. So the distance is equal to the square root of h, and in this case h is equal to 14. So 14, h minus x, 14 minus 8 squared plus k, which in this case is 22, minus 14 squared, right? Because y in this case is 14. And all you would have to do is solve whatever is on the right side to get the distance. And if you notice, anything that you do inside the bracket, even if you get a negative number, it'll always turn into the positive. That's how you know this formula really works, because distance can never actually be measured in negatives. So let's go on and solve this equation over here. So 14 minus 8 is 6. So the square root of 6 plus 22 minus 14, which is 8. So 8 squared. So 6 squared and 8 squared. Right? So the distance is equal to 6 squared, which is 36. So the square root of 36 plus 8 squared, which is 64. And remember, we have to do everything inside the square root first. So first we have to add both of these. So 36 plus 64 will get you 100. And the distance is equal to the square root of 100. And the distance is equal to 10, right? 10 units is the distance between both of these points. So that actually is how you use the distance formula to solve for the distance between both of these points. Now let's go on to solve for the midpoint of two given points. So say for example I had point 1 over here, point 1, which is x and y, and I had over here, I had point 2, and point 2 in this case was the same thing as we did before. It was h and k, right? So now what we want to do is we want to find the midpoint. We don't want to find the distance, we want to find the midpoint. So we want to find a point on this line, on the distance line, that will split the distance line evenly into two even parts. So how can we find the midpoint? Well, the midpoint is simply just the average of both the x coordinates, which is x and h, and the average of both the y coordinates, which is y and k. So all you'd have to do to find the midpoint is you'd have to first make a midpoint point, and then all you'd have to do was x plus h over 2 to get the x coordinate of the midpoint, and y plus k to get the y coordinate for the midpoint. All you're doing is finding the average of both of these midpoints to get the middle point, or the midpoint. So that's basically it. I don't really think you guys need a demonstration for this because it's really straightforward. So let's move on to finding a point given the midpoint and an endpoint. So in this case, say for example you had point 1 over here, say it was x and y, right? And you were given this point. And you were also given the midpoint, right? You knew that the midpoint was h and k, right? Say for example, but you didn't know the other endpoint. You didn't know what the second point was, right? Well, how would you actually find that? Well, let's give a point to two different x and y values. We'll say a and b, right? Remember the midpoint formula where we had to find the average of both p's? Well, it's all it is just that. To find the a value, all you have to do is you have to use the midpoint formula. You have to say for example, actually no, I'll give it real numbers from this point on forward. I'll say m is actually, point 1 is actually 1 and 2, and m is actually 3 and 4. The midpoint is 3 and 4. So now let's look on finding a and b. So we know that 1 plus x, or in this case it would be a, right? 1 plus a over 2 is equal to 3, right? As 3 was the x coordinate in the midpoint. So we know this equation is true. And to find the y coordinate, all we have to do is 2 plus b over 2 is equal to 4. Sorry, brain fart there. Is equal to 4. So now all we have to do is solve it to get the x and y coordinates for point 2. So 3 times 2 is 6. 6 minus 1 is 5, and a is equal to 5. So the x coordinate for point 2 is 5, and solving this, a 8 minus 2, b is equal to 6. So the coordinates for point 2, instead of a and b, we can quite easily solve it and get 5 and 6, right? So that's basically how you find another endpoint given a midpoint and a start point. So that's all for the video, guys. I hope you enjoyed, you learned something new. As always, if you have any comments or concerns, please feel free to leave it down in the comment section below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Other than that, thanks for watching the video, guys.